So Dr. McAllister is also one of our world's experts in an area that's also a great strength at UC Davis, which is in neuroimmunology. It may be an odd concept for you to think about a field such as neuroimmunology, but I think once you've heard Dr. McAllister's talk, you're going to be sold that this is a really, really big and important area, both for understanding how the brain develops and how the normal brain works, as well as understanding many brain disorders.
Thank you, Cam. So as you'll probably realize by the end of the talk, Dr. Carter's a little bit biased because he's a very close collaborator on some projects that we have in this field of neuroimmunology. Okay, so first of all, I want to thank you all for sticking around. I know this has been a long afternoon. It's been a lot of fun. I've been amazed at how many people are having such great fun conversations out in the demonstrations, and thanks for sticking around. So we have heard a lot about neurological disorders, and despite the fact that I am also a member of the neurology department, I'm going to tell you about another class of brain diseases that you haven't heard about today. And these are psychiatric and neurodevelopmental disorders. And so everybody in this room, I'm sure, are familiar with psychiatric illness. Psychiatric illnesses affect 15 to 20% of the population worldwide, which means that at least 1 out of every 5 people in this room have experienced a psychiatric illness at some point in their lifetime. This figure on the left shows mental illness by the numbers, and I think this is really, really revealing. So about 1.1% of American adults in any given year have schizophrenia. 6.7% have major depressive disorder. That means that it affects about 16 million American adults. 2.6% of American adults, about 6 million, have bipolar. 4.1%, about 10 million, have attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or ADHD. And all told, about a quarter of American adults experience a mental illness in any given year. In addition to psychiatric disorders, though, there are also a wide range of neurodevelopmental disorders, many of which many people in this room are also familiar with, and probably the one that has received the most attention recently because of the increase in incidence is autism spectrum disorders. So as many of you know, autism is a complex neurobiological disorder. We're going to talk a little bit more about that impairs a person's ability to communicate and relate to others. And many of you have probably heard about the increasing incidence of autism within the United States and really within the world. Today, autism affects 1 in 88 children and 1 in 54 boys, which makes it more common than pediatric cancer, diabetes, and AIDS all combined. So these are very common diseases of the brain. Now, many of you are probably sitting there thinking, well, gosh, how is she going to talk about all of these different psychiatric illnesses? Because they manifest themselves in very, very different ways. And as I think Dr. Wheelock or Dr. Lawson mentioned, we don't know the cause of a lot of psychiatric illnesses. But what we do know is that generally, a wide range of psychiatric and neurodevelopmental disorders are caused by dysfunctional brain connections. And so it's great to go last in a series of speakers because that means that you're all familiar with brains, you're familiar with the different brain regions that are really make us human. You're familiar with what those different brain regions are made up of, which is this complex circuitry of these really beautiful brain cells called neurons that are found throughout the brain tissue. And you've been introduced to synapses already. These synapses are the connections between these neurons. These neurons are actually covered with synapses. Their whole surface are covered with these connections, such that each brain cell is covered with tens of thousands of connections across its dendritic arbors. So these connections are shown here with these little balls of light. That's to signify the fact that these neurons are communicating with one another. And they communicate through chemicals. They communicate through the secretion of chemicals called neurotransmitters. And those neurotransmitters bind on the other side of this connection to receptors and channels, like Dr. Lawson was talking about. And it's really the chemical communication that then leads to changes in the electricity of cells that allows for information transfer to occur properly in the brain. And in these disorders, in general, it's thought that either that communication is dysfunctional for a variety of reasons, or the development of those connections and the number of connections might not have formed properly during brain development. Okay, so the good news in thinking about psychiatric illness is that we have a lot of effective treatments that are available for many, many different psychiatric disorders. And these psychiatric treatments are terrific for a number of individuals. There's a lot of conversation, I think, on college campuses and within our society about the stigma of mental illness. I just want to stop my talk just for a quick second and make a point that these are they are diseases of the brain just as much as neurological disorders are. And the treatments that we can have, in addition to behavioral treatments, which are absolutely fantastic, are also drugs that can alter the structure and function of those circuits within the brain. So a lot of the psychiatric treatments that are currently available are ones that many of you are familiar with. They target a series of neurotransmitters that you've probably heard about. This includes norepinephrine that regulates attention, motivation, pleasure, and reward. Serotonin that regulates obsessions and compulsions, and dopamine, which generally regulates alertness and energy. And a lot of antidepressants, which many of you are familiar with, target the serotonin and more recently both the serotonin and norepinephrine systems. Antipsychotics tend to target the dopamine system, but newer drugs are starting to target multiple of these different neurotransmitter systems together. So all of these treatments, though, so far, target these neurotransmitter systems, and the idea is to improve functioning of that chemical communication across connections within the brain. Okay, so that's the good news. The bad news is that today mental illness still exacts an enormous personal and economic toll, and it accounts for a larger proportion of disability than cancer or heart disease within our society. So there's a real unmet need to come up with new treatments to alleviate this personal and economic toll. So it turns out that even though we do have effective treatments for a number of psychiatric disorders, there are still a large number of individuals that do not respond to our current treatments. For autism, for instance, there are no effective drugs right now that are commonly accessible to treat this disorder. For schizophrenia, the good news is that 50% of individuals respond well to antipsychotics. However, 30% of individuals with schizophrenia do not respond at all. And even for the 50% that do respond well, there are a series of symptoms that you don't typically hear about. The symptoms you associate with schizophrenia are probably hallucinations and delusions, but there are also negative and cognitive symptoms that include blunted emotions and very serious impairments in attention and working memory that are debilitating to these individuals. And those negative and cognitive symptoms do not respond to treatment. What's really remarkable in thinking about these statistics is that there have been no new classes of successful drugs for mental illness that target new pathways for over 50 years. So there are new drugs, and they're better drugs, and they work more effectively in a larger number of individuals, but they focus mostly on those neurotransmitter systems that I showed you in the last slide. So I would argue that given this enormous personal and economic toll, we need to find new pathways to target to develop new therapeutics to treat mental illness. And so there is a general approach that individuals within the field of neuroscience have started to use and to apply to find new treatments for a number of different kinds of illnesses, including psychiatric illnesses. And that approach is shown here, and I'm going to come back to this a couple of times during my talk, and so I want to go through this. The idea is that you first identify your disease, you characterize it well, and then you figure out at least one cause of it. And historically that's been thought of as a gene. And for something like Huntington's, that's where it's so exciting because you know what the gene is that causes it. We're going to come back to this issue for schizophrenia and autism in a few minutes. But the idea is once you know the gene, you can then develop a mouse model or other animal models of the disease where you can really study what the disease-related mutations in those genes do to the development of the brain and to the function of those connections within different brain regions. And that's what's called disease pathophysiology. And once you know that, then you have a whole series of molecules or proteins that might be dysregulated in this pathophysiology that you can then target to develop new drugs against. And then you go through the very rigorous and lengthy and costly process that we've been talking about in almost all of these talks to develop novel therapeutics. And the idea is obviously before you go back into humans, you have to go through this cycle multiple times. You need to go back and test those in the animal models in order to see whether your drug rescues the disease pathophysiology that you're interested in. And that's not just behavior. Now we can see whether it rescues changes in connections and function of those connections, which means that our therapies should be much more knowledge-based and more direct and hopefully more effective. So the idea is that once the cause of a disease is identified, molecular pathways can be discovered in these animal models that can then be targeted to develop new treatments that may be more effective, but also tools for earlier diagnosis so that you can use those treatments potentially to be even more effective. So at UC Davis, we've been employing this strategy in particular on two psychiatric illnesses, schizophrenia and autism. I hope that everybody in the room knows about the Mind Institute here at UC Davis. It's an incredible resource. There are amazing researchers there. If you don't know about the Mind Institute, please come up and talk to us afterwards because you should know about that. I wear a lot of hats here. I'm also a member of the Mind Institute. And I hope that all of you know Dr. Carter's been very modest here and hasn't given a talk on his research, but we have an amazing group of schizophrenia researchers that's led by Dr. Carter, and he runs an EDACT clinic, which is a clinic, I hope I characterize this correctly, that sees at-risk individuals for psychosis and treats individuals as they go through their first break and as they deal with the results of becoming and having schizophrenia. He also studies the cognitive neuroscience and the cognitive changes using some of the imaging techniques that Dr. DeCarli talked about to try to figure out what actually might be causing schizophrenia. So that brings us to the cause. If we're going to use our rubric to develop new therapies, we have to know what the cause is so that we can then model it in mice and start to develop new targets. And the problem and the challenge here is that the etiology or the cause of many of these psychiatric illnesses, including autism and schizophrenia, really isn't known. We do know that both disorders are heritable, which means that they get transferred within families. There are families that have a large number of individuals with autism or schizophrenia. And so there must be something about genetics that is contributing to this. We also know that there are quite a few environmental factors like infection or like toxins in the environment that have also been associated with both autism and schizophrenia. So the way that people are thinking about this now is that there are a very large number of genes. It's not a single gene like in Huntington's, but there are a very large number of genes, potentially over 100, maybe even more genes that are associated or linked to autism or schizophrenia. And that those mutations in those genes interact with a large number of environmental factors, including infection and toxins, to lead to aberrant neural development, which then leads to neurobehavioral dysfunction, which is how autism and schizophrenia are diagnosed. So when you have so many genes and you have so many environmental factors, how do you make sense of this? How can you start to come up with new therapies? One way that we in the field are trying to do this and to approach this is to say, if you look at all of those genes and environmental factors, is there a common set of pathways that you can get into from all of these different genes and from all of these different environmental factors? And there are multiple common pathways. And the common pathway that we've been focused on here at UC Davis is looking at whether immune dysregulation might be common to both genetic mutations and to environmental factors. So as I mentioned, the causes of schizophrenia and autism are not known, but recent work from genetics and studies of environmental contributions to these disorders indicates that both mutations in immune genes and altered immune signaling contribute to both disorders. And so now we can start to fill in this pathway where you have genetic mutations in immune genes that are associated with autism, or in other genes that lead to either ineffective immunity in having an ineffective toxicant clearance, or altered immune responses to other environmental stressors, including infection. Those interact with environmental influences that tend to converge, even though there's a wide range, they tend to converge on altering immune function. And that in addition to altered development of the brain, there's also altered immune development. And so the immune system is being altered at the same time as the brain is. And that can lead to long-lasting changes in brain function, which we'll go into in a couple of minutes. And so in addition to neurobehavioral dysfunction, there's ongoing immune dysfunction in both of these disorders, at least in a subset of patients. Okay, so why am I talking about the immune system? Many of you some of you I think are students, and there's some faculty members, and you've heard me talk about this before, but if you hadn't, you might think I came to hear about neuroscience, I didn't come to hear about immune system, what's going on. And as many of you know what the immune system is. The immune system is really important for all of us. It protects us against infection, and it also allows our skin to heal after tissue damage, right? So we know in general what the immune system does. And the reason that people would have been surprised about a neuroscientist talking about the immune system is because communication between the immune system, between all of these immune cells, and the central nervous system, the brain, was thought not to occur. And this was dogma up until about 15 years ago. And the reason it was thought not to occur is because of this structure here labeled the BBB, which you maybe have heard of as the blood-brain barrier. And that is a physical barrier that prevents, typically, immune cells from infiltrating into the central nervous system, and has been thought to prevent even communication with chemicals that are secreted in the immune system. What we've learned in the last 15 years has really been a complete paradigm shift in how we think about this. What we've learned is that there's quite a bit of communication both ways, and we now know that crosstalk does occur between the immune system and the brain, and that it's critical for the brain and body's normal functioning. So the immune system and the central nervous system are physically connected. There are immune cells that live in the brain, and there are also nerve terminals that come from the brain and innervate our immune organs. And they can alter our immune responses through direct innervation. And the languages that are used in the brain and also in the immune system are the same. There are neurotransmitters that actually alter immune cell function. There are synapses on those immune cells that they make that include neurotransmitter receptors. And the immune language, these cytokines, these immune signaling molecules, also are produced and signal within the brain. And so there's quite a bit of overlap. And what's been really amazing about this paradigm shift is that rather than thinking of inflammation as a negative thing, as a bad thing for brain functioning, what's happened as we start to realize that this crosstalk is present is that we found that neuroimmune interactions are primarily beneficial, and that they're very important in promoting typical brain function, homeostasis, keeping the brain within a healthy range. So what happens when you start to change the amount of inflammation in the brain? What starts to happen is that you go from that optimal functioning into a disease realm, okay? So what we've learned, and I'm summarizing a whole bunch of studies that are not my own at this point, are that in healthy individuals, the immune system positively regulates learning and memory. So in many of you, especially young kids and students, your immune signaling molecules that are present in your brain are absolutely important for your brain to function properly and for you to learn. And so if you look at what's plotted here, this is the amount of brain inflammation. That's how it's talked about. I think we should call it immune signaling because that has less of a negative connotation. As that increases, what's plotted in blue is the impact on memory. So memory and neuroplasticity goes up until it reaches a maximum. And then as your immune signaling increases, it starts to go down. What this means is that too little or too much, and you're not in your optimal range for learning and memory, okay? As your brain signaling starts moving into the inflammation side of this, you start to go from your learning and memory decreasing into a realm where now you're starting to increase your excitotoxicity, And in fact, you can cross over the seizure threshold and potentially have an inflammation-induced epilepsy that can happen. And you can start to get neurodegeneration. So while I started out talking about psychiatric illness, there's quite a lot of overlap, and it may be that this immune signaling is something that, depending on when it happens and what the nature of that immune signaling is and how much it occurs relative to normal, you could go from psychiatric illness or effects on learning and memory into degenerative disease and excitotoxicity. So how does this work? There's a lot of research here at UC Davis, and actually just within a handful of labs at this point, as the idea that immune cells function in the brain starts to become more accepted. Because remember, this is a really new idea. But this work has started to give us a sense for what immune molecules are actually doing in the brain during development. And my basic research lab that focuses on brain development focuses a lot on some of these immune molecules and how they might regulate typical brain development. In addition to immune molecules like MHC1 and cytokines, there are a lot of different names, they don't matter. But in addition to those, we also know that there are immune cells called microglia that are found in the brain, and that those microglia play similar roles to the roles of immune molecules. And in general, what these molecules do is they regulate a process called synaptic pruning. So many of you, when you think about brain development, you think, okay, we got to get the cells connecting to each other, we got to let them find their partners, and we got to make lots and lots of connections. And that happens, and that has to happen properly. But then you have to refine those connections. If you keep all of those connections in the brain doesn't function properly. Over time, you have to prune back your excess connections so that you end up with just the right amount of connections in the brain that are functioning properly. And so it's thought that too little immune signaling can lead, and too little microglial function up here can lead to an excess of synaptic connectivity and atypical development. But also, too much immune signaling, too much microglial activation can lead to much less synaptic connectivity and also atypical development. So it's one of these things, it's a Goldilocks situation where you have to be just right. You can't be too little or too much. So why do we think that there's a role for immune dysregulation in autism and schizophrenia? So it turns out that both of these disorders are linked to a strong or abnormal immune response during the development of the brain. There are genetic linkages with genes that are found in a population of individuals with autism or schizophrenia that are genes that encode immune molecules. They're genes that encode MHC class I molecules, or that include components of microglial signaling or cytokine signaling. We also know that patients and their relatives have an increased incidence of autoimmune disorders for both schizophrenia and autism, that there are increased blood or brain cytokines that actually can be measured in individuals with ongoing disease. And we know that maternal viral infection is associated with increased incidence. And this is an infection that's a severe infection at the end of the first trimester that has this association. And so how are we thinking about how this might work? This is a general schematic, it's a modeled slide of what we're thinking about. And the idea is that you can have a number of different risk factors, either by themselves or in combination with each other, that are illustrated on the left. And this includes environmental factors, infections, toxins, maternal factors, or genes. Or you can have mutations in your immune genes that cause you to respond differently to the environment. And any one of those different risk factors can lead to altered signaling in the immune system, which can then lead to altered signaling of immune cells or molecules in the brain, which I just summarized for you in the last slide, leads to changes in brain development, connectivity, and plasticity. And ultimately, where those changes in connectivity happen and when they happen during development may indicate what kind of psychiatric illness you end up with, autism or schizophrenia. And this is for the subset of those diseases that have a neural immune basis. I think one of the things that I didn't point out at the beginning that I should point out is that these illnesses are really heterogeneous. They're defined by a spectrum of symptoms, and for every individual, those individuals have a subset of those symptoms. And so that's why, for instance, autism isn't called autism anymore, it's called the autism spectrum. And so we think that this may constitute a subset of individuals with these disorders. We don't know how much. We think that it could be quite a lot, given the links of these to the different disorders. So here at UC Davis, I mentioned that we're focusing on this idea. We have actually formalized this relationship by bringing together in an interdisciplinary effort 8 different laboratories here that have already been working together on this immune hypothesis for schizophrenia. We've been working together for about 3 years. This has been funded by a really innovative, I think visionary program from the Office of Research. So at most universities, when you're an investigator, you have to write your grants, and often you can't try new things or work with other people because you don't have enough data to prove to the government that they should invest in you. And one of the things that UC Davis did about 3 years ago was to say that they wanted to promote these interdisciplinary groups because Davis has these amazing faculty that like to work together. And Dr. Wheelock was talking about this earlier. We really are unique in that, and the administration realized that. And so they put these pilot funds into this program. And it allowed us to start to test the hypothesis that mutations in immune genes or changes in immune signaling within the brain that's caused by a whole series of environmental effects that lead to immune dysregulation, that either of those or those together alter a common molecular pathway within the brain. And that could be true, it could not be true. I'll show you why we think it is true in a minute. But the idea is, if there is a common molecular pathway in the brain, you can get into it in a number of different ways. And if you can treat it, then you might be able to prevent at least some of the effects of these different risk factors. And so the goal is to use those common molecular pathways to develop novel diagnostic tools and drugs that allow for earlier detection and treatment of neural immune-based forms of autism and schizophrenia. And so we'll come back to this approach, the general approach that I showed you a few minutes ago. Now we can start to fill this in for what we're looking at. So we're starting out here with schizophrenia and autism. We found that there are genetic and environmental risk factors that tend to converge on immune dysregulation within the brain. We have developed a mouse disease model that we use in my laboratory and several other models across the university that are really important. We're using those models to figure out what the basic neurobiology is. What happens to those connections in these animal models? And what we're finding is that in these models there is a common pathway, and at least so far we found that there are 5 new immune targets in the brain that are shared across different animal species that are initiated by these schizophrenia and autism related risk factors. And so now what we're hoping to do is to find more of these shared molecules, but we also want to start to target these molecules to develop new diagnostic tests for earlier detection and also novel therapeutics. And so we're kind of just starting here. I can't wait until we can start doing the cycling around and start testing some of the new therapeutics. So in general, what I've told you is that schizophrenia and autism are really complex illnesses. They're caused by a combination of genetic mutations and environmental exposures, many of which converge to cause immune dysregulation during development. Immune dysregulation may alter cognition, so learning and memory and our ability to think, through changes in synaptic connections that result from altered levels of immune molecules in the brain or altered signaling of those immune cells in the brain, those microglia. And then finally, I want to end on I think an important note and something that I'm really excited about, which is that immune dysregulation may also contribute to a wide variety of psychiatric and neurodevelopmental disorders in addition to schizophrenia and autism that we've found data for so far. And that includes epilepsy and neurodegenerative diseases such as Parkinson's, Huntington's, and Alzheimer's diseases. So ultimately, immune molecules, we think, are exciting new targets for developing new classes of therapeutics to treat psychiatric disorders and possibly a range of other neurological disorders. So typically we have a thank you acknowledgement slide. There's no way for all of this work that I could acknowledge everybody, but I do want to point out the faculty members that each lead and represent a group of at least 10 to 12 students and postdocs and technicians that are doing all of the work and that are really open and working together in our interdisciplinary collaboration. It's incredibly exciting and gratifying to work with this great group of people. And with that, I'll take some questions, and then I had some final thoughts and thank yous at the very end. Thank you.